Hello there, this is Dirumunduluru and welcome back. I hope you are able to complete the exercise successfully. If so, a huge congratulations. But if not, I'm at least expecting that you must have coded much of the logic. It's fine if it is not working perfectly, and this demo should be helpful in spotting the issue and in also improving your coding skills. Now the problem is if you could not even get started. Okay, so that's a problem. That's because we have already been through several lectures, we looked at many demos, and we have been through a couple of exercises too. So by now, at least you should be able to code the logic, formulate the logic. So if that's not happening, perhaps maybe you're not doing the lectures properly. So make sure you're not rushing through the lectures. Okay, so that is something that I always tell my students. Don't rush through the lectures. Make sure you're paying 100% concentration on every single word that I'm saying. Okay, so understand the lecture perfectly. Make sure you are also implementing any demos that I'm showing. So when you implement it, and if it is working perfectly, okay, if it is executing correctly, then that will give you some confidence. And of course, you can also play around with that program. And when it comes to exercise, do try your best to solve it sincerely. Let it take some time. It's totally fine. And so do try to invest time in solving it. And if you can get it correctly, that will give you a lot of confidence. I experienced that, during my college days when I was starting off with my programming. When I was able to solve the exercises by myself, even though it took a lot of time, it gave me a lot of confidence. Okay, so do try to implement it yourself, and hopefully this demonstration and the next 1 or 2 exercises will also help you in gaining confidence and getting more experience. Okay, so without any delay, let's go ahead and code the solution. I'm going to code up the entire solution here. So let's look at what we have here. So we are supposed to implement 2 methods. One is the calculate GPA method and the other one is get students by GPA. So the input is the student ID list and the students' grades. Okay, and so the second one is a 2-dimensional array, and there is a 1-to-1 correspondence between this 1-dimensional array student ID list and students' grades. Okay, so the first parameter has the student IDs and the second one has the grades corresponding to the students, right? And we are supposed to compute the GPA of each student and store it in a double array, and that is what is written here. So here is a simple example that we have, and it's just a sample data. Okay, so the input can be anything. It can be 100 students and 100 different grades also. So it can be anything. So this is just a simple sample data, and here we have 2 students, and this is a 2-dimensional array which is showing the grades of these 2 students. Okay, so the first element here is a 1-dimensional array and it shows the grades of the student 1001, and the second one is the grades corresponding to the second student. So the second student has signed up for 3 courses, and these are the grades that he or she has received. All right. So this is a 2-dimensional array. So what we need to do is we need to process this 2D array. Okay, and for that we will be using a for each loop. We need 2 for loops, 1 for loop to process this entire 2D array, and in each iteration we also have one more 1-dimensional array to process. Okay, and for that we need one more for loop. So it's going to be a nested for loop. Okay, and we will use a variable. Okay, in the outer for loop we will use a variable, and that variable will hold the grade, okay, the sum of the grades. So initially, for instance, when we are processing the first student, when we are in the first iteration, the value would be 4 when we encounter A, and then we will add another 4 during the second iteration of the second loop, and that's how we accumulate that variable. Okay, so we need a variable in the outer for loop, and that accumulates the value. So that's how we compute the sum of the grades, and finally to get the average we need to divide by the number of courses that he or she has signed up. So in this case it would be 4, and in case of second student it would be 3, right? So that's what we need to do. So let's go ahead and code it up. So I'm using my Eclipse here. So this is the exact template code that I have given you in the description. So this is what we are going to fill, and I have this main method with some sample data. So let's go ahead and fill this template. So the first thing is, let's declare the variable that we are going to return. So let's call it as GPA list equal to new double, and since it's an array, it needs to be of certain size. In this case, the size would be the total number of students that we have. So we can take the student ID list and we can say dot length, right? So that will be the length of this particular array, and it will include all of the GPAs of the students. And we want to return this one. So that's that. Now let's go ahead and write our business logic. So the first thing is we need to take the students' grades and we need to iterate through it. Okay, so let's go ahead and use for each. So that's what I mentioned in the problem description. Try to use for each because it is easier to iterate, right? We have seen the advantages of for each loop. So let's just go ahead and do that. So here we have each element is a character array, right? A single dimensional character array, and let's name it as student, right? Because in each iteration we are processing the grades of a single student. So let's have a singular here and let's call it as grade and this colon, okay? And then we need to further process the grades of this student in the current iteration. So this goes here, all right? And each element is a character. So we will have char and let's call it as grade here, okay? So this is not the index of the array. This is the actual element of the array, right? So that's what it is. And if these two arrays are not clear, if you're not clear, it means that you did not follow the lecture properly on for each. So you need to go back and review that particular lecture, all right? So the next thing is we need to compute the sum of the grades for each student. So we will say sum of grades, okay? Let's name it nicely. And let's initialize it to 0, and then here we need to accumulate this value, okay? So in each iteration there is a grade, so this value keeps changing. So we can use an if or a switch statement. So let's go for an if here. So if the grade is A, then we will take this and we'll say plus equals 4.0, right? So 4.0 corresponds to A. Now else, if it is B, then we need to increment the grades by 3.0, okay? And this needs to be B. Okay. It's okay to get a B grade once in a while. And this needs to be else if. And if it is C grade, it's not very good. It means the student is partying a lot. So that's not very good. Okay, so that's that. Now, so that's the sum of the grades of the current student, right? So when we are processing the first student's grades, so this iterates and it computes the sum of the grades, but we need to get the average. So we will say double, let's say average equals to, let's get this value sum of grades, and we need to divide it by this one, student. Let's call it a student grades because it is list, and here also it's grades, student grades, and dot length, right? So that's what we have. So that would give us the average, but this average needs to go into our GPA list, right? It needs to go here, but where do we store it? Would we store it at 0 or 1? No, we cannot hard code it. It needs to be an index at some index. So we will declare a variable called index and we will say store it at that index, and for the next student it needs to be at the next index, so we need to increment this, right? So this is what we have, but we have learned that instead of using these two statements, we can just use one of them. We can simply say index plus plus, and that would take care of that. Okay, so we don't need these two statements. So because this alone will is equivalent to both of those statements that we had earlier. So it would first assign average to GPA list of index, and then it will increment it, right? That's how it works. Now you can leave it like this, or if you want to, you can also take this. Okay, we can eliminate this variable and just make it a little bit more elegant, I guess. And that's it. That's what we can do. And here, let's just go ahead and run this. Okay, let me also comment this one. All right, so here we have the 3 GPAs corresponding to these 3 students. Okay, so we have 3 students in the corresponding grades, and these are the GPA values. All right, so that's the first method. Now let's go ahead and code the second one. Okay, so the first thing is we need to do some parameter validation. So if we go back, we said that we need to do some parameter validation. Now this method is going to use the first method, right? And basically it returns all the student IDs whose GPA is within this range, lower and higher, and both of them are inclusive. Okay, so that's what we have to return. So the output will be student IDs whose GPA is within the range. And to get the GPAs, we will use the first method, right? But this one also has to do some parameter validation. We want to ensure that the lower and higher values are not negative, and lower should not be greater than higher, right? Only then we would process, we would further proceed with the method. So let's go ahead and do that. So we will say if lower is negative or higher is negative, or lower is greater than higher, then that's not good, which means the parameters are not good. So we just return a null here. But if that's not the case, then we would simply invoke, then we are good with the parameters, and we can go ahead and invoke our calculate GPA method and pass it student ID list that this method is receiving, right? And the second one is the student's grade. So we are simply relaying the data that this method is receiving, and it would return a double array, right? So that's what it returns, and we will use the same variable here, name GPA list, and we have it that. And we need to return the student ID list. So let's say this, let's call it as result equal to new int, and it needs to have the size, but this size need not be same as the student ID list, because of all the students, maybe only a subset of them have the GPA in this range. So we need to compute the size of that subset. Okay, so for that we need to use one more for loop. Okay, so that's what was suggested in the declaration, in the problem description. So we would just take this GPA list and let's say grade, sorry, this can be GPA, okay, and it's a double value, all right, and so we need to compute the size of the resulting array. So let's use a variable called count, which is equal to 0, and we'll say if GPA is greater than or equal to lower and GPA is less than or equal to higher, then it means that the student's GPA is within our range, okay, and we will increment the count, right? So by the end of this count value will have the count of the number of students who have the GPA in the desired range. So this is what we have, and now we need to populate this result with those IDs. But we need to have access to the index value. So we cannot use for each if we need index values, right? Okay, so let's use a for each statement here, a for statement, a traditional for statement. So that's what we are going to do here. So let's just say int I equals to 0, I less than, you can still say GPA list dot length I plus plus, and here let's use this same condition and we will change it. So this will be GPA list of I, okay, is greater than or equal to this, and is of I is less than or equal to higher. Then we need to take this result and it will have some index, right? For that we need to use a separate index. Let's call it as index. Okay, so let us say the first student, okay, I is equal to 0, does not have this GPA in this range. Then we are going to skip this if statement and I would be incremented to 1. And let's say the student 1 at position 1 has the desired GPA, in which case it needs to be saved into the array, okay, right? But this one will be 0, whereas this one would be 1, right? The student is 1, but we need to store it at the position 0. So that's where we will use index. Okay, so that's why we need an additional variable here just to index. And here, instead of GPA list, we will say student ID list. And this would be I. Okay, so I would be different from index. And we need to increment the index. So we will say index plus plus. So that's all there is. And we need to simply return the result. Okay, so that is good. We are done with our program. Let me just uncomment this code that is invoking the method, and we are simply printing ID values and we are passing 3.5 and 4.0. Okay, so only two of the students have the GPAs in the range. So the GPA range is 3.5 and 4.0. So this is 1001, this is 1002, and this is 1003. So clearly the second student did not have the GPA in the result, and so 1002 is filtered out and only 1001 and 1003 are being printed here. All right. So that's the second method. All right. But quickly, let me just show a couple of mistakes, at least one mistakes that certain students have made, many students have made. So let's look at that. So some students have done this. They have, in the first method, they have made this an int here, okay, and what they did was they left it like this. So what happens is this is int and this is int. Now does that ring a bell? So if both of them are int, the resulting output will also be int. So you may recall from the arithmetic rules lecture, so there was a rule over there, like same type operations is what we called it as. So if both the operands are of the same type, then the result will also be of the same type. So in this case, if both of them are int, the result will be int. So you won't get a double value. So it will be truncated. So if it is 3.33, then it would be truncated to 3. So that's a problem, and many students were facing that. Perhaps they forgot about that particular rule. All right. So in that scenario, we need to make this double, or we can also use a cast. Okay, so first let me run this. As you can see, the GPA is 3. It got truncated to 3, and hence the second method, it's not displaying the ID values because none of them have that range 3.5 to 4. Okay, so the solution is either you make it double or have a cast here, right? So let's just run this and that's it. Okay, it's the same output, but let's change it back to double here. And let's remove this, we don't need this. And that's about it. Okay, and many students have used for loop here, a traditional for, but the preferable way is to use for each and use traditional for only here. Okay, in this case, because we need this I value, index value, so we had to use traditional for loop over there. If we had used the regular for loop for each loop, then we would have used more variables in order to track the index, and that would be cumbersome, right? So, and some students did not know how to use this count, how to get the count, so they were struggling with that. And many of them have correctly used a switch here, which is also good. So you would just say switch like this, and you would say grade here, right? And you will have a case statement here. So I don't know if we need to code this one, case and this, and we will just say break, right? So that's what we will do here also. So let me just quickly type that. That's it. So that's how it works with switch statement, and I hope this was very useful, and that's about it, and happy coding.